My name is Michael Carter. I'm 35 years old, and last Thanksgiving, my parents demanded I save my brother's failing business. What they didn't know was that 2 weeks earlier, I had quietly become the new owner of the company he owed nearly $500,000 to. The moment it all unfolded happened at my parents' dining table, surrounded by turkey, mashed potatoes, and the same family traditions we had followed for decades. Thanksgiving had always been my mother's favorite holiday. She believed it was the one time every year when the entire family should sit down together, forget disagreements, and remind each other what really mattered. In theory, that sounded nice. In reality, our Thanksgiving dinners had a strange pattern. The conversation almost always drifted toward my younger brother, Daniel. Daniel had been the center of my parents' attention for as long as I could remember. He was charismatic, confident, and constantly chasing big ideas. Unfortunately, those big ideas often involved businesses that burned through money faster than they generated it. Over the years, he had started 3 different companies. The first one sold custom fitness equipment online. It collapsed within a year after he underestimated manufacturing costs. The second was a food delivery startup that tried to compete with companies already dominating the market. That one lasted 18 months before quietly disappearing. Each time a business failed, my parents reacted the same way. They told everyone Daniel had simply been unlucky. "He's ambitious," my mother would say proudly. "Entrepreneurs take risks." Meanwhile, I had taken a much more traditional path. After finishing business school, I joined a financial consulting firm and spent more than a decade helping companies fix their financial problems. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't the one with exciting startup stories. But I was stable, which meant that whenever Daniel ran into trouble, the family conversation eventually turned toward me. This Thanksgiving dinner started no differently. The table was crowded with food, and my mother was happily refilling everyone's plates while my father carved the turkey. Daniel sat across from me, unusually quiet compared to his usual energetic personality. I already suspected why. 2 weeks earlier, I had seen financial reports connected to his latest venture. The numbers were not good. Halfway through dinner, my father cleared his throat. "Michael," he said, setting down his fork. That was always how these conversations started. "Yes? There's something we need to talk about." Daniel shifted in his chair slightly. My mother gave him an encouraging look. "It's about Daniel's company," she said. Of course it was. I leaned back in my chair calmly. "What about it?" My father folded his hands together. "The business is going through a difficult period." Daniel quickly jumped in. "It's temporary," he said. "Every startup has cash flow issues in the early stages." That might have sounded convincing to someone unfamiliar with financial statements. Unfortunately for him, I spent my entire career analyzing those statements. "How serious are the issues?" I asked. Daniel hesitated before answering. "There are a few short-term debts." My father continued for him. "The main problem is one creditor that's putting pressure on the company." My mother looked directly at me. "They're threatening legal action if Daniel can't repay the loan soon." "And how much is the loan?" I asked. Daniel avoided eye contact. "About $480,000. The number didn't surprise me. I already knew it. What interested me was what my parents said next. My father leaned forward slightly. "You've done well for yourself, Michael." I didn't like the direction the conversation was taking. "I've been fortunate." "You have savings," my mother said gently. "And Daniel just needs a little help getting through this." There it was. The real reason for this discussion. "You want me to pay his debt?" "It's not paying," my father corrected quickly. "Think of it as an investment." Daniel nodded eagerly. "Exactly. Just a short-term loan until the business stabilizes." I looked around the table. 3 pairs of eyes were waiting for my answer. My mother spoke again. "Family helps family, Michael," my father added quietly. "You have the resources. Daniel just needs one more chance." For a moment I said nothing. Not because I was thinking about the decision, but because I was thinking about something else entirely. 2 weeks earlier, I had signed documents that changed this entire situation. Documents that made this conversation far more interesting than anyone at the table realized. I took a sip of my drink and set the glass down carefully. Then I looked at my brother. Out of curiosity, I said calmly, "How much do you owe your main creditor exactly?" Daniel frowned slightly. "I just told you, about 480,000. I nodded. "And the company you borrowed it from?" He shrugged. "Some mid-sized logistics financing firm." That was technically correct. My mother leaned forward impatiently. "Michael, this isn't the time for details." "Oh, I think it is," I replied, because the truth was something none of them saw coming. The creditor they were worried about was now sitting at the dinner table with them, and in a few minutes, I was going to tell them. If you had asked my parents which one of their sons was more likely to become successful, they would have answered without hesitation, Daniel. Not because he had a better track record, but because he had always been the one they believed in the most. Daniel was 3 years younger than me, and from the moment we were kids, he had a personality that made people pay attention. He was charming, talkative, and confident in a way that made adults laugh, and teachers describe him as full of potential. My parents loved that about him. Whenever Daniel talked about an idea, they listened like they were hearing the early stages of something brilliant. Meanwhile, I had always been quieter. I liked numbers, planning, and figuring out how systems worked. In school, I wasn't the loudest or the most charismatic student, but I was the one who finished projects early and double-checked details. Those traits turned out to be useful later in life, but growing up, they didn't impress my parents nearly as much as Daniel's enthusiasm. If Daniel talked about starting a lemonade stand when he was 10 years old, my parents helped him design signs and gave him money to buy supplies. When I mentioned saving money for something practical, my father would smile and say, "That's good, Michael. Someone has to be the responsible one." Responsible. That word followed me for most of my life. As we got older, the difference between us became even more obvious. Daniel loved big ideas. He talked constantly about businesses he wanted to start, apps he could build, and markets he believed were about to explode. My parents treated those ideas like early signs of genius. "He thinks like an entrepreneur," my mother would say proudly to relatives. The first time Daniel actually tried to start a company, he was 24. It was an online fitness equipment store. My parents helped him secure a small loan and even let him use their garage as storage space for inventory. The business collapsed less than a year later when the cost of shipping large equipment turned out to be far higher than Daniel expected. My parents didn't blame him. "Every successful entrepreneur fails the first time," my father said. The second company came 2 years later. This time, Daniel decided to build a food delivery platform designed for smaller restaurants that couldn't afford the big national services. The idea sounded good in theory. The problem was that by the time he launched, several major companies already dominated the market. The business struggled for 18 months before running out of funding. Again, my parents defended him. "He just needs the right opportunity," my mother insisted. I watched all of this from a distance. Not because I didn't care about my brother, but because I had learned something early on. In our family, Daniel's failures were considered part of his journey. My role was different. I was the one expected to clean up problems when they appeared. While Daniel was experimenting with startups, I had followed a much more predictable path. I studied finance, joined a consulting firm, and spent more than a decade helping companies understand why their businesses were struggling. Ironically, many of the problems I analyzed for clients looked very similar to the ones Daniel created for himself. Poor cash flow management, unrealistic growth projections, borrowing money before proving a business model. But when I tried to explain those risks to my parents, they dismissed the concerns. "You worry too much," my mother said once. "Daniel is a visionary." Visionary. That word made me smile every time, because in finance, vision without discipline usually ends in debt. Which brings us back to Daniel's third company. 3 years ago, he launched a technology platform designed to help small retailers manage their shipping and inventory. On the surface, it looked promising, and for a while he managed to attract a few investors. But eventually the same pattern started repeating itself. Expenses grew faster than revenue. Marketing costs exploded. And in order to keep the business alive, Daniel borrowed a large amount of money from a logistics financing company that specialized in funding high-risk startups. $480,000. When he took that loan, my parents told everyone the company was about to scale rapidly. They believed Daniel was finally on the edge of success. But 2 months before Thanksgiving, I happened to review financial data connected to that same logistics financing company. And that's when I noticed something interesting. Daniel's company wasn't just struggling. It was weeks away from defaulting on that loan, which meant the creditor was preparing to seize control of the remaining assets. Most people would have ignored that information. I didn't, because I realized something else at the same time. The financing company that held Daniel's debt was quietly looking for a buyer. And that opportunity changed everything. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I bought the company, which meant that by the time my parents started asking me to help my brother during dinner, they were unknowingly speaking to the person who now owned the debt he couldn't repay. And the best part? Daniel had absolutely no idea. The opportunity appeared almost by accident. 2 months before Thanksgiving, I was reviewing financial reports from several mid-sized logistics companies for one of my consulting clients. Part of my job involved analyzing the stability of firms that provided financing to small and medium-sized businesses. Most of those companies operate quietly in the background of the economy. They lend money to startups, supply chains, and retailers who need short-term capital but can't easily get loans from traditional banks. One company in particular caught my attention: Carter Logistics Financing. They weren't a large firm, but they specialized in lending to startup companies involved in distribution, retail technology, and e-commerce logistics. When I examined their records, something immediately stood out. They had a loan portfolio that included several risky accounts. One of those accounts belonged to my brother's company. I recognized the name instantly. Daniel's startup had borrowed $480,000 from Carter Logistics Financing 6 months earlier. The loan had been structured as a short-term growth investment with aggressive repayment terms. In simple terms, Daniel had bet his company's survival on the assumption that revenue would grow quickly enough to cover the debt. It hadn't. The report showed that his company had already missed 2 scheduled payments. A third missed payment would trigger default, which meant Carter Logistics Financing could begin legal proceedings to recover their money. Normally, that wouldn't have been my concern. But as I continued reading the financial reports, I noticed something else. Carter Logistics Financing itself was struggling. They had issued too many high-risk loans and were dealing with several clients who couldn't repay their debts. Because of that, the owners were quietly exploring the possibility of selling the company to stabilize their finances. That's when the idea first occurred to me. At first, it sounded ridiculous. Buying a financing company was not a small decision. Even a struggling firm like Carter Logistics Financing had dozens of clients, employees, and ongoing contracts. But the more I studied the numbers, the more the opportunity made sense. The company's problems weren't fatal. Their management simply needed someone willing to restructure the risk in their portfolio and stabilize the operation, which was exactly the kind of work I had spent my career doing. So I contacted the owners. Our first meeting happened in a quiet conference room 2 weeks later. The founders were tired but practical. They knew their company needed stronger financial leadership, and they were open to a deal if the terms made sense. Over the next several days, we negotiated the acquisition. When the agreement was finalized, the transaction transferred ownership of the entire company to me, along with every asset and every debt. That included Daniel's loan. The paperwork was signed exactly 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. When the deal closed, Carter Logistics Financing officially became part of a new holding structure under my control, which meant something very simple from a legal perspective. Daniel's company no longer owed money to an anonymous lender. It owed money to me. I didn't tell him. I didn't tell my parents either. Part of the reason was professional. The acquisition was still being integrated, and there was no need to involve family in the business side of things. But another part of me was curious. I wanted to see what would happen when the truth eventually surfaced. And Thanksgiving dinner turned out to be the perfect stage. Because 2 weeks later, as I sat at my parents' dining table listening to them ask me to save Daniel's business, I already knew something they didn't. They weren't asking me to help my brother. They were asking a creditor to forgive a debt. And creditors don't usually make decisions based on family dinners. The dining room had gone quiet after my parents asked me to help Daniel. My mother was still holding the serving spoon over the bowl of mashed potatoes. My father leaned forward with his hands folded on the table, and Daniel watched me carefully, waiting for the answer he clearly expected. They all assumed this conversation would follow the same pattern our family had repeated for years. Daniel would run into trouble, my parents would defend him, and eventually, I would be the one expected to solve the problem. But this time, the situation was different. This time, I already knew how the story ended. I picked up my glass and took a slow sip of water before answering. So the business needs $480,000, I said calmly. Daniel nodded. Technically, it's a little less after the last payment. But yes. My father leaned forward. You've always been financially responsible, Michael. We're not asking you to give him the money. It's just a loan. My mother added quickly. Daniel nodded again. I just need breathing room until the next investment round. I watched him for a moment. If someone didn't know the numbers behind his company, that explanation might have sounded convincing. But I had already seen the financial statements. There was no upcoming investment round. There were no investors waiting. There was only debt. Who exactly do you owe the money to? I asked. Daniel shrugged. Some financing company, Carter Logistics Financing. My mother waved her hand dismissively. They're the ones threatening legal action. My father frowned. They've been extremely aggressive. I almost smiled at that. Aggressive. That was one way to describe a lender trying to recover nearly $500,000. Daniel leaned forward slightly. They've given us a final deadline, he said. How long? 3 weeks. My mother looked at me again. That's why this is so important. She spoke slowly, like she was explaining something obvious. If Daniel can repay the loan, the business survives. And if he doesn't? I asked. My father answered this time. Then the creditor can seize the company's assets, Daniel added quickly. But it won't come to that if I can just stabilize things. The confidence in his voice reminded me of every other time he had defended one of his failing ventures. My mother reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He just needs support, she said. Then she looked back at me. You're his brother. There it was. The emotional argument, the same one my parents had used every time Daniel's businesses collapsed. Family helps family. But instead of answering immediately, I asked another question. How much do you owe exactly? Daniel sighed slightly. I already told you, about $480,000, and the loan is with Carter Logistics Financing. Yes, I nodded slowly. Then I asked the question that started changing the mood in the room. What happens if that company decides not to negotiate? Daniel frowned. What do you mean? I said calmly. What if the owner of that company decides to enforce the contract instead of offering another extension? My father shook his head. They wouldn't do that if the debt is repaid. That's true, I replied. Daniel leaned back slightly. Look, Michael, this is simple. He spread his hands across the table. You help me clear the loan. The company stabilizes, and I'll repay you once revenue improves. I watched him for a moment. Then I asked the final question. Out of curiosity, have you ever met the owner of Carter Logistics Financing? Daniel shook his head. No, it's a corporate lender. My mother sighed. Why does that matter? I set my glass down carefully on the table. Because things changed 2 weeks ago. 3 pairs of eyes looked at me. What do you mean? My father asked. I leaned back slightly in my chair. 2 weeks ago, Carter Logistics Financing was acquired. Daniel frowned. Acquired by who? I let the silence stretch for a second before answering. Me. The table went completely silent, and Thanksgiving dinner had just become a very different conversation. For a few seconds after I said the word me, no one moved. My father blinked like he thought he had misheard something. My mother was still holding the serving spoon in midair, and Daniel just stared at me. "What do you mean, you?" he asked slowly. I folded my hands on the table. "I mean exactly what I said. 2 weeks ago I acquired Carter Logistics Financing." The words seemed to land in the room one piece at a time. My father leaned forward. "You're saying you bought the company?" "Yes." Daniel let out a short laugh. "That's not funny. I'm not joking." He shook his head. "No, that doesn't make sense. That company finances dozens of businesses. 32 active clients," I corrected. "And now I'm responsible for all of them." The room fell quiet again. My mother slowly lowered the spoon back into the bowl. "So the company that Daniel owes money to," she said carefully, "is yours?" "Yes." Daniel stared at me like he was trying to solve a math problem that suddenly had too many variables. "That's impossible," he said. "You would have told me." "Why?" "Because," he stopped himself, "because we're family." But that argument didn't work anymore. I leaned slightly forward. "You borrowed $480,000 from Carter Logistics Financing 6 months ago," I said calmly. "The repayment schedule required monthly installments beginning 90 days after the loan was issued." Daniel's expression changed immediately. He knew those details were correct. "You've missed 2 payments," I continued. My father turned toward him. "Is that true?" Daniel looked uncomfortable. "It's temporary." "That wasn't the question," I replied. My mother looked between the two of us. "So if Michael owns the financing company," her voice slowed as the realization formed, "then Daniel owes the money to him?" "Legally speaking," I said, "yes." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything else that had happened that evening. Daniel pushed his chair back slightly. "You can't be serious." "I am. This is insane." He rubbed his forehead. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying the situation is exactly the same as it was 10 minutes ago," I replied. My father frowned. "How?" "Daniel still owes $480,000. My mother's voice sounded smaller now. "But your family." "That's true. So you can just forgive the debt," she said quickly. Daniel nodded. "Exactly. This solves everything." I looked around the table. 3 people waiting for the same outcome they had always expected. The responsible son fixing the golden child's problems. But the difference this time was simple. This wasn't a family discussion anymore. It was a business one. And businesses don't operate on the same rules as Thanksgiving dinners. I picked up my glass again. "You're not asking a brother for help," I said calmly. Daniel frowned. "What are you talking about?" "You're asking your creditor." The words hung in the air like a final correction. My father leaned back slowly. "This is complicated?" "Not really." I turned toward Daniel. "Your company signed a contract. That contract still exists." Daniel's voice tightened. "So what? You're going to sue your own brother?" "I'm saying the loan has terms." My mother shook her head. "Michael, this is your family." "Yes," I said. "That's why I'm still listening." Because if Daniel had borrowed that money from anyone else in the room, they would have already started preparing bankruptcy papers. But this story wasn't over yet, because the next thing I said would determine exactly how the night ended. And for the first time in our family's history, the power in the room belonged to me. No one touched their food anymore. The turkey sat untouched at the center of the table while the weight of the conversation settled over the room. My father was the first one to speak again. "So what happens now?" he asked. His voice was careful, the way someone speaks when they realize the situation is no longer under their control. I leaned back slightly in my chair. "From a business standpoint, there are 3 possible outcomes." Daniel frowned. "You're really doing this like a boardroom meeting?" "That's exactly what it is," I replied. He didn't argue with that, because technically, that's what the situation had become. My mother looked uneasy. "Michael, we're still at Thanksgiving dinner, and Daniel is still $480,000 in debt." That quiet reminder brought the conversation back to reality. My father nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Explain the options." I held up one finger. "Option 1, the company pays the debt." Daniel let out a short laugh. "If I had that money, we wouldn't be having this conversation." "That's correct," I said calmly. which meant option 1 was already impossible. I raised a second finger. Option 2, the loan is restructured. Daniel leaned forward slightly. That's what I've been asking for. Restructuring means extending the payment timeline while increasing oversight. I explained. Oversight? It means I would have direct access to your company's financial reports and operational decisions. Daniel's expression tightened. You want control of the business? I want to protect the loan. My father nodded thoughtfully. That sounds reasonable. Daniel didn't look convinced. What's option 3? My mother asked quietly. I raised a third finger. Default. The word landed heavily on the table. Daniel's face darkened. You mean bankruptcy? Essentially, if the loan isn't repaid and no restructuring agreement is reached, Carter Logistics Financing would take control of the company's remaining assets. Daniel pushed his chair back slightly. So you'd just shut my business down? If the numbers say it can't survive? Yes. My mother looked horrified. You can't do that. I can. The room went quiet again. For the first time all evening, Daniel wasn't arguing. He was thinking, because beneath his usual confidence, he understood something very clearly. The rules had changed. For years, he had been able to rely on family to soften the consequences of his business decisions. But this situation wasn't about family anymore. It was about a contract. And contracts don't care about childhood memories or Thanksgiving dinners. My father rubbed his chin thoughtfully. So restructuring is the only realistic path. Most likely. Daniel finally spoke again. And what exactly would that involve? Financial transparency, I said. Monthly reporting, budget approval, and restrictions on new debt. He frowned. You'd basically be supervising the company. Yes. My mother looked between us. But that means the business survives. If it's capable of surviving, I corrected. Because the truth was something none of them wanted to say out loud. Daniel's company might already be beyond saving. But I wasn't finished yet. Because the final part of this conversation had nothing to do with spreadsheets or loan agreements. It had to do with something much more personal. And what I said next would make that very clear. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after I finished explaining the options. My father leaned back in his chair, processing everything I had just said. My mother looked between Daniel and me as if she was still trying to understand how a Thanksgiving dinner had turned into a financial negotiation. Daniel stared down at the table. For once, he wasn't arguing. He was thinking. Finally, he looked up. So if I agree to restructuring, he said slowly, the business keeps running. Yes. And if I don't? Then the company defaults. The answer was simple. The consequences were not. My mother spoke first. Daniel, you should take the restructuring. My father nodded. It's the responsible option. Daniel looked at me again. You'd really shut the company down if I refused? I would follow the contract. He sighed. Of course you would. The comment wasn't meant as an insult. If anything, it sounded like reluctant respect. For years, my family had seen me as the cautious one, the responsible one who always focused on numbers instead of big ideas. Now those same traits were the reason the entire situation was under control. Daniel leaned back and rubbed his temples. I guess I don't have much choice. There's always a choice, I said. But some choices are smarter than others. He gave a small laugh. Sounds like something you've been saying our entire lives. Probably. For a moment, the tension in the room eased slightly. Then Daniel looked up again. All right, he said. I'll agree to the restructuring. My father nodded with relief. That's the best outcome. My mother finally picked up her fork again, as if the dinner might return to normal. But before the conversation could drift away, I said one more thing. There's something else? 3 faces turned toward me again. What? Daniel asked. I folded my hands on the table. The restructuring agreement will include one additional condition. Daniel frowned. What condition? I met his eyes. You don't take another loan without understanding the numbers first. He stared at me. You mean, ask you? I mean, analyze the business properly. For years, Daniel had treated his ventures like exciting experiments, trusting that enthusiasm and ambition would eventually solve the financial side. But businesses don't run on enthusiasm. They run on math. Daniel exhaled slowly. Fair enough. My father raised his glass slightly. Well, he said, I suppose that solves the problem. My mother looked relieved. Family helps family after all. I didn't argue with that. But I couldn't resist one small correction. For years you told me to support Daniel's businesses, I said calmly. They all looked at me. My mother smiled. And tonight you finally did. Yes, I said. Then I took a sip of my drink. Just not the way anyone expected. The dinner slowly returned to normal after that. Plates were passed again. The turkey was finally carved properly, and the conversation shifted to safer topics. But something important had changed. For the first time in our family, the responsible brother wasn't just cleaning up Daniel's mess. I was the one deciding how the story would end.